Welcome to the AM Update, Week in Review. A collection of the best moments from Aaron McIntire's morning update.
You've probably seen a few headlines the past few days. U.S. representatives sound alarm over slowing port activity. Trump says ports running empty is a good thing. Cargo at the Port of L.A. is down 35%. And so on and so forth. China freight ship traffic to busiest U.S. ports sees steep drop. The last boats without crippling tariffs from China are entering U.S. ports. And on it goes. Well, is that actually true? You'll be surprised to know, no, it's not. In fact, there is one reporter from CNN, Jonathan Lemire, who reports 0 ships from China are bound for California's top ports. Officials haven't seen that since the pandemic. Well, what does the actual data show? According to Bloomberg's Terminal, that's a very robust computer application that shows real-time shipping, financial data, just a massive tool for traders and stockbrokers. According to Bloomberg's Terminal app, on May 10th, which is the same day that report from CNN saying that there were no ships from China in the last 12 hours, because everybody knows that's the most important metric in the last 12 hours. The very day that he sent that, there are actually 53 ships headed for California's top ports, all of them from China. And all of these ships are big ships. They're not completely full, but they're mostly full. And by the way, 53 ships on May 10th. Is more ships that were inbound to the United States from China than on May 10th of 2024, a year ago. So, yeah, maybe a small decrease in shipping from China to the United States, even amidst these tariffs. It's not the cataclysmic showdown that these media reports are trying to show that it is. I publicly predicted about 3 weeks ago that by today, May 12th, we would understand, we would kind of have an idea of who has the upper hand in the tariff war. It would be clear how this tariff war was shaking out, and I made that prediction based on shipments from China. Well, in the last week, we got a marginally better deal with the United Kingdom. Put a bookmark into that. A marginally better deal, the type I've also predicted here on AM Update would happen for most countries, China notwithstanding. We're now being told, rather unexpectedly I might add, we're much closer to a deal with China after this weekend's Switzerland meeting, and shipping from China hasn't really slowed. By the way, a marginally better deal, I laid this out last week, just want to make sure it's clear. Marginally better deal with one country like the United Kingdom is one thing. Marginally better deals with 25 or 30 countries, that's unquestionably a good thing for U.S. producers. So I think if you were just analyzing this in a vacuum, China hasn't really slowed down, which means what? They're paying those tariffs. Will some of that be passed on to the consumer? I'm sure some of it will be, but it hasn't completely. They've just made their bet. They're going to have to pay these tariffs. They have to. So they haven't completely shut down everything yet. We got the first of, we think, many deals with the United Kingdom, and we're really close to a deal with China. And we're basically a month into this. So I don't know whether this is, I don't truly know what the posture is of the Trump team, whether they still feel like they're in an advantageous position or whether this didn't really go like they had planned. And so they're just kind of taking what they can get in the short term, and then they'll go and pursue a longer term strategy of isolating China. I don't know. But it certainly seems like if you were analyzing this in a vacuum, maybe not the total domination that you were hoping for, but still, there are pieces moving and things that are unfolding that are good for you. Like I said, marginally better is still better. Even if it was a marginally better deal with China, I think I'd quibble with that a little bit. We definitely need a path of decoupling from China. But taken as a whole, we're seeing movement, and the movement is in our benefit from what I can see.
You're listening to the AM Update, Week in Review. Follow on X and Instagram at RealAMUpdate.
I'm starting to wonder if Pope Leo XIV's X account was run by somebody that wasn't actually him, because his commentary, or at least the retweeting or reposting of commentary, totally flies in the face of much of what I've seen from the Catholic Church's new leader. Here he is in a 2012 interview. This was 2012, discussing probably the biggest threat to Western civilization. This is his opinion. Let me know what you think.
Certainly you cannot just take at face value what's offered in today's society by mass media. And I think personally that the answer, rather than turning away, is in the area of formation. How do we teach people to become critical thinkers? How do we teach people to understand that not everything you hear or everything you read should be taken at face value? And how do we come to give people the formation that they need to read something or to hear something, and to be able to discern, if you will, to understand that underlying the message that's being communicated is a very different message, or a very subtle message that has severe consequences for the future of society, let's say, that can or cannot be understood as a part of a much bigger picture, if you will. I began reflecting on this topic myself because of having lived outside the United States now for a number of years. And then when I would go back to the United States and perhaps just watch a TV show at random or visiting friends or relatives, seeing the change that has taken place in the kinds of content that are in sitcoms, that are spoken about on your regular TV programs, even on news shows, the kinds of messages that seem to be portrayed, the slant that is taken at times in whichever direction, the kinds of even polemical argumentation that is presented on TV in the United States. Following through with that, I think it's not just the United States. We find that a lot in the Western world, and it changes from place to place depending where you are. After giving my intervention, an Italian came to speak to me about it and said, well, he didn't agree with what I said. For example, the mention of abortion. He said, well, we don't talk about that in Italy. And I said, well, maybe you don't in Italy, but we certainly do in other parts of the Western world. But then he came up himself with other examples of how the media has been used in Italy to present certain kinds of arguments, certain political questions, that in the same way, if you control the media, you can at least partially control the way people are thinking, because that's the message that people hear constantly. So again, I think our real challenge is in formation. Our challenge is in preparing people to become critical thinkers and to understand what's going on in the world around us.
That was an interview with then, well, he wasn't even a cardinal yet in 2012, Robert Prevost, who is now the Pope of the Catholic Church, Pope Leo XIV, talking about essentially what he's saying there. He's discussing the scourge of manufactured consent that is just rife within our media. And it reached maybe its apex, or maybe even its birth, but it came out of the gates like gangbusters in the midst of President Barack Obama. Now, media manipulation, media bias, that's been a thing for long before I was even born. But this new notion of manufactured consent, which is basically we have our own competing expert class that can move in the digital age at the speed of light, reacting to, forming narratives, see what sticks, see what doesn't. We can basically overwhelm the traditional structures of fact-checking, of actually playing the role that the Fourth Estate is supposed to play. We can circumvent all of that in the digital age by just anointing a new crop of experts on any issue. That is what Barack Obama did to a T, and did almost perfectly for his entire administration. There's a great piece over at Tablet Magazine that discusses this phenomenon that we don't have time to get into this morning, called Rapid Onset Political Enlightenment. And it discusses the phenomenon of manufactured consent. And I think that's what now Pope Leo XIV is talking about there. And at the end, talking about how the most important role he believes that the church, his church, has to play, and I know it's not my church, but it is his church. He's talking about the churches, and it's his church. He believes that the church's role is to make sure people can think critically so that they can bust through media narratives that attempt to form their opinions for them, that attempt to do their thinking for them. Again, that was 2012, right in the middle of Barack Obama's presidency. There's been more where that's come from. I've seen him talk openly, and I think this was even after he was named Pope or elected Pope last week, talking openly about how, in using different words, transhumanism is a major threat to humanity. Transhumanism is the philosophy espoused by the World Economic Forum's resident philosopher-in-chief Yuval Noah Harari, which essentially says that humanity has evolved to the point where we don't really need traditional biological functions anymore, not using them in their traditional sense, that artificial intelligence is essentially going to make most human life obsolete. That's my understanding of what transhumanism is and how he wants to take that on. So his commentary on immigration notwithstanding, some of his reposts on X notwithstanding, which still have my spidey senses tingling, I think maybe this guy is a little bit different than how he was first billed. But we'll find that out in short order as we watch the papacy of Leo XIV, Pope Leo XIV, play out. Again, I'm not a Catholic, so I don't believe the same things about the Pope, what he is, what he claims to be, that the Catholic Church believes in. But I recognize how powerful and how beneficial the position of Pope can be for civilization as a moral voice. And if it's channeled in the correct ways, basically the opposite of Pope Francis, how much of an ally, really, in the fight against the transhumanists, the Marxists, the communists, how much of an ally that Pope can be. Here is Joe Rogan, still the #1 podcast in the Western Hemisphere, breaking down the atheist's claim of creation versus the Christian claim of resurrection of Jesus Christ. A fascinating clip, especially coming from the source.
Well, space is the ultimate who the knows, because we can only see so far. We see so far, but even so far is only so far.
Well, and then they're saying like it's always expanding, which that can't be true, because like what is it expanding into? If space is space, you know, if they're like, oh, it's like blowing up a balloon where everything's okay, but you're blowing up a balloon in a room,
right?
So what's the room that you're blowing the balloon into? And then that's in a bigger room, and then that's in this.
And then there's the concept that it's actually finite. It's not infinite, and it's some sort of donut shape. It like goes back around eventually.
But then who made all that?
Right.
Like, is there a God? Did God make this?
Or is God the universe?
Yeah, but then who made God? And then that bothers me.
Right. But
like, who made that thing?
Is that a thing that we think that, like, because we were born and we die, that we have these biological limitations that we attach to the universe itself?
That's fair. That we see things as being built and destroyed. That
there's always been something. Well, wouldn't it be crazy if there wasn't something at one point in time? That seems even crazier. Then there always has been something. Because if it's just something, if it's just the nature of everything, there is always something, right?
Right.
It couldn't be nothing and then all of a sudden everything. That seems...
Because what started that? What kicked that off?
Exactly.
What snapped its fingers?
That's McKenna's great line. Terence McKenna had a great line about the difference between science and religion is that science only asks you for one miracle. I want you to believe in one miracle, the Big Bang.
Yeah. That's a good one.
It's a great line.
Yeah.
It's because it really is true.
Yes.
And it's funny because people would be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and for no reason that anybody's adequately explained to me that makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Instantaneously became everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on that one. Like, Jesus makes more sense.
Yeah, the trajectory Joe Rogan is on, he's going to be a Bible thumper in like 5 years. That's a good thing. I don't like all the guests that he's had on his program, or at least the way that he has kind of taken kitty gloves to some of them and not to others. But overall, his trajectory is one of of being on the right side of history, of being on God's side, not trying to get God on his side. I thought that was a fascinating conversation. By the way, the other voice that you heard there is Cody Tucker. He is a content creator. HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy spoke to Fox News in an exclusive report late last week talking about the MMR vaccine. And I just want you to take a step back, listen to this as if you were, put yourself in your shoes 10 years ago, and tell yourself that this would air on Fox News one day. Listen up.
We also understand that some people don't do that. The MMR vaccine that we currently use has millions of particles from were created from aborted fetal tissue, millions of DNA fragments, and there are people who have religious objections toward those, and those people should be treated with compassion. If they come to a hospital and they're sick, we need to know how to treat them. And one of the failures of the CDC in the past is they weren't telling doctors, no kid should die of measles in this country. Even in 1963, before the introduction of the vaccine, there were 400 deaths a year, and there were up to 2 million measles cases. So it's only very, very sick kids should die from measles, and nobody should.
There's some that were saying that the rubella portion of the vaccine, and you were talking about the produced from the fetal cell line, originated from an abortion that took place in the 60s. But the MMR vaccine doesn't contain the cells in its final form.
It doesn't contain cells, but it contains DNA fragments.
Got it. And so that's your point.
Yeah. So, and people have religious objections to that. And although I might not share those objections, I respect them. And I think those people, a lot of the Mennonites told me, and I went down there and spent time with the community during the outbreak, and they said they didn't want to go to the hospital because they were treated as pariah. They said we were treated like lepers there. And that should not be part of American health care. If somebody comes in, if they have a religious objection, we should still be treating them.
That is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., HHS Secretary. Again, tell yourself 10 years ago that sort of content would air on a place like Fox News. That we're going to be talking about aborted fetal tissue, that's dead baby body parts, being used to develop vaccines like the MMR vaccine. And that would air in good company, polite company, on Fox News. And saying, very charitably, that people who have religious exceptions to technologies like that deserve compassion and welcome. That is a tectonic shift in the Overton window. The Overton window, what's allowed to be discussed in polite company that we've decided, in this country or in a culture. That is a tectonic shift in the Overton window.
You're listening to the AM Update, Week in Review. Follow on X and Instagram at Real AM Update.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says this is the, at this point in time, best possible outcome of talks with China.
We have a very good framework, and as I said during IMF week in Washington about 3 or 4 weeks ago, there is a possibility, it's not a certainty, but that, as Ray Dalio might say, we could do a big, beautiful rebalancing. President Trump wants to rebalance the American economy back to a manufacturing economy with high precision manufacturing. I think everyone agrees, including Chinese leadership, that they need to rebalance towards more of a consumption and consumer economy. And the dream scenario would be if somehow we could do that together.
So there is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying that the United States needs to produce more. That would be manufacturing. China needs to produce less and consume more. That is the rebalancing that he's talking about, and saying that if they could do this cooperatively, that would be the ideal scenario. Now, I've seen and heard various people within the Trump administration in recent weeks saying, no, we're not trying to decouple from China, or yes, we're trying to do a strategic decoupling. To me, this is kind of somewhere in the middle, where you can't just shock, and I think we've learned that now, you can't just shock the system and decouple from China. And any honest observer would have said that going into whatever these talks are now. So that is Scott Bessent with what he believes would be the ideal scenario, ideal outcome from talks with China as it stands now. Now, who actually called these Geneva talks in the first place? China said, essentially, that America came and groveled to them. If you have Trump derangement syndrome, you're saying that the United States was the ones who capitulated and came groveling to China. However, if you're trying to actually analyze things as objectively as possible, you don't really know. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I saw, and I know a number of you saw this as well, that Zero Hedge reported on a Chinese delegation being spotted entering the Treasury Department. And some photos were taken of them. And this Chinese delegation back in late April demanded these photos be destroyed as they were entering the Treasury Department. Now we have a story at the Financial Times saying that the talks to start these talks in Geneva actually happened late last month during a previously unreported, though that's not true because Zero Hedge reported it, a previously unreported encounter, a Chinese envoy at the Treasury Department. That doesn't sound like the United States groveling. If they are sending people to Washington, D.C. to try to meet with Bessent at the Treasury Department, at the Department of the Treasury, that does not sound like America was groveling. I think, and I said this as much on Monday, I think the United States is winning the tariff war. It's not a rout, it's not a landslide, but winning. What I keep coming back to is we are China's, by and large, we are their largest geopolitical competition. If what President Trump was embarking upon was honestly and permanently damaging to our country, why would China try to stop us from damaging ourselves? Why would they even give us the time of day? But if they are communists, if they really kind of live and die, and I mean that literally, quite literally, if that party lives and dies by the perception of its people that they are powerful, that they cannot be bullied, then of course you're going to make it seem like the United States came groveling to them. And you're going to make sure that if you sent an envoy, if that wasn't true and you sent an envoy to Washington, D.C., you would make sure the envoy was not photographed. Because that would make it seem like China was groveling to us. So there's a little bit more evidence about whom called the meeting between the United States and China. And it's looking like it was China, I think. Anyway, this is kind of the topic of this week's poll of the week. I asked you, is the U.S. winning the tariff war? I gave you 4 options. Yes, obviously. Of course not, they're not winning the tariff war. It's complicated and Orange Man bad. Here are the results. In 4th place, the option of Orange Man bad. 4th place at 2.5%. 3rd place, of course not, is at 4.2%. In 2nd place, it's complicated. Comment below. That was at 19.2%. And yes, obviously, we're winning the tariff war. That was number 1 at 74.1%. Let's go to this. China Compass says, I think we agreed to meet just a little too soon. Not sure why things couldn't have played out at least long enough for one fully tariffed ship to cross the Pacific. I think I kind of understand that. And this sounds counterintuitive. But if this were hurting the United States more than it was China, then time is on China's side. They see the world as unfolding in 100-year cycles. We see it as unfolding in 2 or 4 6-year cycles, political cycles. So, if anything, it would have been, if this was going to draw on at all, it would have been because I think they saw themselves in an advantageous position. Now, I don't think that actually is true. I don't think it's true for the reasons that I laid out earlier this week. If you're China and you see this as a self-imposed wound against your just foremost geopolitical foe or competition, let's call it that, then you just let them, don't let your opponent, don't try to intervene when your opponent is shooting themselves in the foot. But they didn't do that. They agreed to meet and talk. Now, why, if you're the United States, why wouldn't you just let this play out? If you do believe you have the upper hand, well, it's because we operate in 2, 4, 6-year political cycles. So if they're ready to meet, let's get this thing going. Let's see if we can strike a deal or give a 90-day pause while we strike out a more comprehensive deal. So I get what you're saying, China Compass, but I think if you're the Trump administration, you're looking for results. That's something that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has talked about. Auburn Tiger says, yes, cautiously optimistic. Don't drone me, bro. I would say that it's too early to tell. We don't really know the full details of the agreement that were made, and the talks with China are still in the early stages. I'm hopeful that things are better for Americans and American workers at the end of the day, but the average American didn't have to get out of their comfort zone since Liberation Day. I don't like Trump saying how we're going to bring in all this money from the tariffs because it simply isn't true relative to our national debt and deficits. However, it can be used to disrupt the status quo and level the playing field for some American workers, then LFG. That's a good take, and I think it strikes a balance between let's pump the brakes on long-term tariffs here, because you're absolutely right. I just don't see a way you can have relatively high tariffs on most of the world and have an income tax. I don't think your citizens can survive that long-term. I just don't think that can happen. However, if they are just still being used as a bargaining chip, and in the case of China specifically, maybe long-term tariffs, relatively high tariffs can work to bring about the rebalancing that Scott Bessent talked about yesterday. More of a consumer-based economy for China, more of a production-based economy for the United States, some sort of a rebalancing there. I think that can work because Council of Economic Advisors Chairman Stephen Mirren has made the case that the incidence of tariffs actually falls on China because of how vastly over-leveraged towards the American market they are. So I'm willing to give long-term tariffs a chance with China, but not as a rule for the rest of the world, which kind of raised my eyebrows a little bit with the UK deal, because they were touting a 10% permanent tariff on the UK. KM says, I think less than 1% of Americans, myself included, fully understand the dynamics of international trade policy. Difficult to really have a grip on it. Hope Team Orange Man are doing a good job. Okay, I appreciate the self-awareness, and I'm trying to have some self-awareness myself. I've studied this a lot since Liberation Day, and I feel like I'm still in the 99% that you talk about there. I feel like I know a lot more now than I did a month ago, but I feel like I've only scratched the surface. My fear is on this and other platforms that because of my interest in this topic and my fascination by it, and most people don't understand it or not interested in it, my fear is that by highlighting it so often and so frequently, that people are bored by it, because I think you might be right that 99% don't really understand or care. But I understand. I see what you're saying. Caravan DLM says, I'm not informed enough on the issue, so I avoid giving my takes. Okay. Kind of the same vein as KM. The Forester said, short term, yes, Trump will open up some markets that the United States isn't used to entering. But long term, once the Democrats or weak-kneed Republicans, once the next Democrat or weak-kneed Republican gets into the Oval Office, the deals will go back to the status quo, which will in turn be a shock to the U.S. market. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, Forrester. I mean, that would be, if these things are successful and tangibly successful, like the GDP picks up, we're exporting more, not just our treasury bills. We're actually exporting and producing more, and there are more manufacturing jobs and good paying jobs. It would be incredibly politically unpopular to then go back to the status quo from before Trump. I understand your skepticism and maybe cynicism a little bit on some level. Jim Heron said it would be pretty cool if we had any idea. I guess he'll do what he does, and we'll have to see if it works. Erica says, I picked Orange Man bad because that means I don't have to think and compare it to everyone else. That's how it works. Regular Dirk says, if you take the perspective of Trump's narrative, we're just now beginning to hold ground in a war we have been losing for decades. See, that's the premise that you need to start from. I mean, I think that's obvious, and I think it's what's missing from the premise of most people who are just opposed to these policies. What are you prepared to do to actually deal with the China problem? What are you prepared to do about it? Because it is a problem. And if you don't agree that it's a problem, I don't know what planet you're living on. Romans 3:23 says, I think you should have added one more option. Yes, but not in a landslide, so a win is a win and we'll take it. Revival said, yes, we're winning and we're just getting started. Back at it again tomorrow.
This has been the AM Update Week in Review. The AM Update will be back on Monday and every weekday at 4 a.m. Eastern Time.